Hi, everyone. Welcome to yet another season of the Sustainability and Climate Podcast. You're seeing our faces today.
Yes.
Welcome, everybody. Hi, Toby.
Hi, guys. Hi, Labake. Happy New Year. For those who are listening to us on Spotify, we are now live on YouTube. So please go check it out on YouTube and see the faces behind your favorite podcast. And so, yeah, we're so excited. This is a season 3 of the podcast. And we just want to show you guys our faces, and we want to take this podcast to the next level. And that's the reason why we decided to start the video part of this podcast. And yeah, please join us on YouTube. Subscribe, follow, share. What else did they say on YouTube again? Subscribe, like, share. Don't dislike, please. Like and share. But yeah, I'm excited.
Spotify also has a video quality. I'm not entirely sure if we can utilize that, but I know it's something we'll check and we'll let you know if it has the video quality as well. But we thought it would be cool to engage with you guys visually as well. You can see us banter in real time.
Yeah.
Reactions and how my hands do its own thing. But yeah. Happy New Year. How's your year going?
The year's going really well. First of all, happy belated birthday to you, Labake. It was about a couple of days ago. You've left the Millennials Club. If I'm I'm just joking. But happy birthday. I pray that this new season bring more love, more joy, and all your heart desires will be met. And yeah, happy birthday.
You so yours is coming up soon, real soon. I don't want to give it away, but the next episode we're wishing you a happy birthday.
Yeah.
I know that we're both early in the year. I feel like it sets the tone for the year, but thank you so much. I had a great birthday.
Awesome. And what have you been up to? I know you've been up to a lot of things. Do you want to share?
What have I been up to? So the start of the year is a very interesting period because a lot of the work that I do, is planning.
Yeah.
In January. So we literally just had what we call, I don't even know if I should say it here publicly. We call our team strategy meeting, annual strategy meeting, the State of the Union kind of model.
Oh, interesting. So true.
Yeah, against the US and like the organization I used to work at when I worked in so we had it earlier this week, and a lot of the work weeks leading up to this week has been kind of planning, working with the different teams.
Nice.
We do the big team annual strategy meeting, and yeah, January is over, right? So a lot of the month is like planning, strategizing, what are we working on, prioritizing this year, and that's a lot of doing. Obviously, I've taken time out to celebrate my birthday because that wouldn't be me if I didn't do I didn't do that. But I think that's been most of my January, planning for the year, really exciting things working on and trying to make happen this year. Yeah. How about you? How's your new role?
Yes, it's going well. I know the last time we were on the podcast, we talked about me starting a new job. So I've started. I'm now the CEO Europe for the African Transformation Center. It's been an amazing.
I'll take a moment to.
Thank you. But yeah, it's been an amazing journey. Loving it. To be honest, I'm not saying it because I'm on the podcast, but I'm really loving the experience, loving to understand more about our programs, and also connecting with some of our partners who have been supporting us over the years, and see how we can expand our growth and also the things that we do. And so it's been an amazing journey. I was telling someone recently that as a CEO, you have an opening time, but you don't have a closing time. Because up to you do meetings 8, 9, because you have people who are in different part of the world. And so, but it's really been an amazing journey, and I'm loving it, loving the process, loving the moment, and loving the amazing people that I work with. So yeah, it's been good.
Oh, that's incredible. Congratulations. I mean, I'm super excited.
Thank you.
Well, I know it's going to be great things.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to see you grow into the role. CEO is not easy.
Right, it's not easy, but we're pushing it.
So today's episode, our first video episode, is an amazing episode. We have a great guest.
Yeah.
So we don't want to take up too much time on this, but of course we have to talk about what's happening in the news, start of the season. We're already laughing. And you know what's really dangerous about
Yeah.
is all our facial expression, all those little, oh my God, you guys are now going to catch all the looks and little moments after that Toby and I do. But yeah, the year started with a bang.
Yeah.
Yeah. Toby, do you want to start with the news?
I saw that. I saw that coming, that we're going to push it to me. You see, sometimes when we give the news, there's some undertone that we give. But now, we have to be very careful if we don't want to have someone looking at us from our windows. But yeah, yes, the US have a new president in person of Donald Trump, who is the 47th president of the United States of America. Congratulations to him. And over the last couple of days, he's been signing executive orders. And one of them was the United States pulling out from the Paris Climate Agreement. And that has caused a lot of conversations. Well, a lot of people, we saw it coming, to be honest, because it did it when he was the 45th president, when he pulled out of that. And so him winning, a lot of people saw it. And I remember a particular phrase he used during his speech: drill, baby, drill. And that also caused a lot of conversations. But we wish America all the best, and we hope that what should I even hope for, to be honest? But we just hope for the best, and yeah.
I think it will be interesting. I mean, president again, and whether we like it or not, this is the reality for the next 4 years.
Yeah.
Right? And because this is something that has happened before, the US has pulled out of the Paris Agreement before. Yeah. It's new, right? We have precedent. We know what happens when they leave. We also know that they're one of 195 countries. I think this time is an opportunity for the rest of the world, or the rest of the countries who are part of the Paris Agreement, to kind of buckle up.
Yeah.
And figure out how to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement with or without the collaboration of the US.
Yeah.
I think it's an opportunity to really re-strategize the role of like bigger nations in these multilateral agreements, and how we can accelerate all our efforts to close the gap where, challenging situations. Oh my God, I'm very diplomatic. I'm proud of my
being diplomatic because you're on camera, but yeah, go ahead.
Yes. But yeah, that's something very interesting that's happened in the last since our last episode. Yeah. What else has happened since our last episode? Obviously, it's a new year, 2025. We're now 5 years to the 2030 goals. Yep. I think these next 5 years, 2025 marks the start of, I think, a lot of show and tell. I'm calling now, where a lot of companies, a lot of countries, a lot of organizations would want to show kind of the success, failures, challenges, kind of the strategies that they've been building over the past 10, 15 years. Yeah. And they're all working towards 2030. I think these last 5 years, a lot of these frameworks also kick into effect. And so we'll start seeing the result, if you will, of some of the strategies that companies have been developing and implementing, and how what the gaps and loopholes are in them, and how we can kind of improve on them, because we're not meeting the targets of the agreements that we're not even close. So I think it'll be really interesting if we use these next 5 years as sort of a focus group, as a global community of, okay, here are some of the challenges we faced over the last 15 years trying to implement or trying to reach these goals, and how can we amend this and do more of this. or whatever the case may be, so that we can actually make improvements on, you know, reducing the Earth warming, and meeting the below 1.5 degrees goal. But yeah.
Fingers crossed. And just one from my side, the UK government, they've been concerns about them saying they want to build a third runway at the London Heathrow Airport, and there have been a lot of conversations around it. Even before it became official, the mayor of London then said it was going to challenge it in court, and up until yesterday, the UK government officially announced it, that they want to build that because of the economic benefit, but also not looking at the economic effects in terms of how will it affect the people. So there have been different calls from climate activists from there for them to stop such projects. But again, the UK government is seeing it from the economic benefit rather than from the environmental effects that this is going to cause on the people. And so we are still monitoring the situation and to see what the final outcome is. Hopefully they change their mind towards doing that, because it's going to cause a huge environmental damage to the people who live in that area. So yeah.
Yes, I have kind of been following that. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes of that. Another news item I thought of is, I don't know if you've seen this, the DeepSeek
yes.
finance AI answer.
Yeah.
That has been very interesting. There's a lot of talk about it being significantly better for the environment. I tried to do some research on that. I haven't seen any concrete data or support for that, and I guess time will tell.
Yeah, I guess because it's still early days, and so yeah.
But it's supposedly better for the environment because it uses less computing power, uses less time, is cheaper, and easier to make or to train the models. So it's meant to be easy, better for the environment, which would be a one-up to the other AI solutions out there. So that's one interesting thing that's been happening. And I mean, it's happening, that's just the, I guess, environmental impact side of it, because it's done, a number on the financial and the political scene as well. So it's, I think that's one that we'll be keeping our eye on for the rest of the year.
All right, fingers crossed. Let's see what happens.
Okay, so do we want to introduce our guest?
Yes. Do you want to do it, or I should do
it? Go ahead.
Well, I'm happy for you to do it, just to, as one of your birthday gifts, and also because you're starting a new season. Please go ahead, Labake.
Okay, so today our guest is a very exciting professional expert. She's the Chief Sustainability Officer at a global bank. I'll tell you which bank in a second. And she leads sustainability strategy, sustainable finance, and net zero delivery teams for the bank. She's worked huge banks, Credit Suisse, Merrill Lynch, that's what I was looking for. So she has quite a decorated career. She's now currently the Chief Sustainability Officer for Standard Chartered Bank. And she is on the board of institutes like the Aspen Institute, Milken Institute Center for Strategic Philanthropy. She's part of high-level working groups sponsored by the World Economic Forum, the UN Oceans Panel. So she has a very decorated career across sustainable finance and sustainability. Our guest today is Marisa Drew.
All right, guys. Yes, as we mentioned, we have a very interesting and amazing guest on the season 3 of the Sustainability and Climate Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, without wasting your time, please join us to welcome Marisa Drew. Hi, Marisa Drew. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here. So thank you very much for having me.
All right. So we just go straight. We don't like beating around the bush. We just go straight to the conversation. Okay. Who is Marisa Drew?
Well, there's a couple of ways I can answer that.
Yeah.
The normal and very traditional way is to say what I do for a living. So,
Yeah.
Chief Sustainability Officer for Standard Chartered Bank, and I have a role that has a mission to mobilize capital at scale. I think my sort of North Star, my guiding light, is mobilizing capital at scale in our markets where we call home. And that's very important because Standard Chartered is very much focused on Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. That's the beating heart of our bank. But we are in 52 footprint markets, mostly developing economies, ranging from middle income, high growth, all the way through what we would call frontier markets. And that is, in some respects, in the climate and private capital space for sustainability, sort of a more earlier stage part of the globe to receive that precious capital. Another way of answering that is, kind of who I am at heart, and I consider myself a very high energy, passionate individual with a short attention span. So what that means is I'm in a really, really big hurry to get stuff done, which is why I think I can marry who I am with what I do in a beautiful intersection in sustainability, because I think the urgency, that hopefully we all feel, I'm sure your listeners are listening because you want to make change or be a part of the change and create the world you want to live in. And time is of the essence to do that. So those are the two aspects of who I am.
Oh, interesting. And now I know. And because it's also important that we try to know more about our guests. And I've picked the points about you from today. So thank you for sharing that.
I think we can all relate as well. Welcome to the podcast, Marisa. My first question is based on something you kind of touched on. Your key objective at Standard Chartered is to mobilize capital at scale. And you've worked in investment banking and private equity for a long time before transitioning to sustainable finance, I think, while you were at your previous role at Credit Suisse. So my question then is, what inspired your transition into sustainable finance? And how did your previous roles in investment banking and private equity, how did it shape your approach to your new role as CSO?
So it's a great question. And, I shudder to say that I've been in investment banking and capital markets for almost 40 years. So it's been a long journey and lots of cycles and, a lot of development of new businesses and asset classes along the way. And another way of answering your first question about who I am, at its heart, I feel that I'm a banker that has helped to finance the industries of the future. So if I go all the way back into the 80s, when I started my career, I often say when you're a baby banker, the managing directors are covering the big, mature, large cap companies. And in my day, and I started in the US, you can probably note from the accent, but I was coming out of business school, the dream companies to cover were companies like IBM, or very large telecom companies like AT&T, these big monoliths, so to speak. And when you're a baby banker, you can either draft in under an MD and try to, cover those large cap companies as a very junior person on the team, or you can go the completely other direction, which is to take on, which is a much more riskier end of the spectrum, companies that were not really, very mature. They weren't fully formed yet in terms of, whether they were going to survive and or make a difference on the world. And there's a little bit of a rebel part of me as well, which is, if somebody says it can't be done, I'm like, bring it on. And I'm always happy to take on a challenge. And so I took on covering these early stage companies, mobile telephony back in the day. We were just in the early days of having mobile phones, moving from pagers, if you can believe it. Early days of cable television, and so on and so on. And so what was fascinating about those early experiences is that as a banker to those companies, the most important thing that you can do is provide them with lifeblood capital. And I say, it's a live or die thing. If companies don't have access to capital in their early stage, they typically won't survive. And therefore, I was very, very important to these companies. I became a partner to them because I was a necessary part of their very survival. And that informed me all along the way, because what I've gotten joy out of in this business is feeling like you really matter. Like, what you do makes a difference in these companies. And then over 20, 30, 40 years, I've watched these baby companies, just like I was a baby banker, grow up and become the industries of the future. I mean, we've kind of bypassed landline telephones. I mean, who has one anymore, right? It's you live on your mobile phone and cable television and broadband, and all these things I've financed all along the way are now the industries. So if we then fast forward to where we are today in sustainability, I believe I've actually kind of come full circle in the sense that I'm financing the industries of the future with this just sustainability overlay, because I deeply, deeply believe the companies that are going to endure and survive are ones that are sustainable from an environmental and social point of view. So in a funny way, I'm coming full circle back to where I started. And that's why the transition into sustainability in some ways was easy. Other ways it was a little hard. And what I mean by that is that at the time that I was asked by my then chief executive to move into this space, I had what was considered the dream job. I was running investment banking and capital markets for a very big firm. I had a massive business, nearly $1 billion kind of revenue business, and 1,000 people and all of this. And my CEO at the time, who was a wonderful man who I admire greatly, called Tijan Tiam, who actually is from Africa, from the Côte d'Ivoire, he plucked me kind of out of nowhere. Didn't know him that well. Something he saw in me, and asked me to basically run sustainability. But at the time, the job of CSO didn't really exist. Now CSO is a thing, but back then, it wasn't really a job category. But it was something about, he was describing to me what this role and position was and the vision that he had for the role. And it was about marrying purpose and profit. It was about doing something that was impactful with the capital for our clients and so on. And so, when I first presented it to me, it took me a while to absorb what he was saying. He had quite a big vision for this. And I think it was because he was the economic and finance minister in, developing African country. And he could see the power of capital to create, economic development and prosperity in his country. And I think he was thinking about that in a much bigger context. Anyway, he challenged me to do a bit of homework on the space, and it was very early days. But the more I dug in, the more I became convinced that this was the future. And so I told him I was in, and then I went from having all of this infrastructure and a massive business to basically and truly, it was like a startup. I had a white sheet of paper and a secretary. I had to go figure out what that meant to build this kind of a business in a big bank. So yeah, it's been a wild and fascinating journey for sure.
Wow, what a journey.
Very incredible journey. I actually have a question right off the back of that. So okay. You said it's been full circle, right? You started off financing the industries of the future, and now you're doing it just with the sustainability angle or lens. And I was just curious, what are some of the similarities or differences of being at the starting point?
Yes.
These two.
So the similarities are so many. It goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning, this lifeblood of capital. These enormous amounts of capital will be needed to create these industries of the future and ensure not only in some cases it's that capital to get the technology going. So many of the key transition technologies for the hard to abate or high carbon emitting sectors, the unlock, if you will, or the answer is going to be a technological innovation. It could be green hydrogen, it can be next generation nuclear in the energy field. In the food system, it could be alternative proteins, whether it's precision fermentation or thinking about lab grown meat and seafood, some of these very, very esoteric things. In other cases, we already know what the technology is, but we need enormous amounts of capital to scale it. So think about solar energy, right? It's just, we are, proliferating solar everywhere. But in order to build those gigantic solar fields, to allow them to, supplant our existing sources, we just need more. So in both cases, capital is the key there. And so that's one of the key similarities. The other bit of that is, when you're financing an early stage company, you're talking about typically companies at that early stage of their life cycle. So there's a lot more risk than, of course, if you're financing a mature business. So you need to identify what those risks are and as much as possible help to mitigate those. Sometimes it's the tech risk. Is the tech actually going to work? Sometimes it is the tech works, but could you get to scale economics where the unit cost of production means that you can commercialize it? Because it's all well and good to have great tech, but if it's too expensive to utilize, then you're not going to survive either. Yeah. And all those sorts of things. Where it's different is, and this is what I think the new thing is in finance, if you will, which is what's so powerful, is that finance 101, if you will, was all about creating returns for one stakeholder, which was your investors, your shareholders. That kind of the concept of creating returns in traditional finance theory, and it's a risk-adjusted return question. What was never taken into consideration in my day when I was going through getting my MBA in finance was the idea of the purpose and profit bit, that the impact lens. So it's risk, return, and impact is that third lens is what are you doing? What is that capital doing to positively influence outcomes or solve problems? And that's the different bit, which is looking through that lens. In some cases, your risk decision is very different. In other cases, if I can put it in these terms, you think about pricing in negative things that we're doing to harm the environment, which the financial system has never calculated before. But those are part of that risk return decision. So if I'm building a factory, but I'm putting in place in a rich biodiverse area, that if I go clear all that land and I've just now massively harmed our ability to actually continue to have a healthy environment, those two things kind of cancel each other out. So yes, on the one hand, it's good. On the other hand, it's really bad. So these concepts that have never really been baked into traditional financial thinking, which now need to be critical. And I'll touch on one more topic, which I think is important, because when I think about it contextually in the continent of Africa or some of my Asian countries, which I would argue in some cases are more disproportionately affected by climate change, if we're not taking into consideration adaptation to the reality is that what we're faced with, and putting capital against adaptive and resilient business models, to maybe ground it in an example. So many of the African countries, a heavy reliance of their GDP is on agriculture. Now, if we have droughts and we have extreme warming, or if we have pest infestation and you can't grow crops anymore, that's going to be catastrophic for the country and the people living there. However, there's so much technology going on. If we can think about putting capital into technology to help us farm smarter, to use less water, or new kinds of crops that are more drought resistant, or all these sorts of things, and fascinating, and satellite technology that can tell you how to grow a crop down to a tiny little shoot in a 100,000 hectare field in a very precise way, which will allow you to have a much more adaptive model. That's really good use of capital, but the system hasn't thought about adaptation finance as being a thing. But that's something that we're driving very actively, and those are game changers, for economic prosperity and also resilience and risk management. So,
wow, that's so impressive to know. And moving on to our next question. Now let's look at opportunities and challenges. And what would you say are the biggest challenges and the opportunities in aligning your bank's global strategy with the sustainability goals?
Okay. Yeah. So as I know you and your readers know, because you've been big champions of this, there are 17 UN development goals. I think one of the challenges is if you're at an organization like mine, if I tried to focus on 17 things at once, I'd probably do very little, right? Because you can't go broad and narrow. You have to go, very specific and deep if you're really going to make an impact. Otherwise, you get very distracted. And that was a challenge when I came to the bank, because there was such passion about sustainability. But because prior to my arrival, there wasn't a CSO, we were a collection of people's passion projects, probably across 17 SDGs. But there wasn't a harmonious way to decide what can we really influence as Standard Chartered. So I came and I did some, observing and learning and listening. And I came out the backside of that exercise in my first 180 days. And I said, we need to go narrower. We need to pick our spots. Let's pick sort of 4 or 5 really core themes that matter most to our clients and our markets, where we have legitimacy or a core competency. And let's lean into those hard and make a real difference in those versus trying to get distracted by 17 things. So I think that's the starting point challenge that I had, because when you tell someone who's very passionate about a topic, you got to let it go, because it's like, this is the one that we're going to focus on. That's kind of a hard discussion, right? Because it's kind of motive. But I think people saw the bigger vision that we could make a deep impact if we were focused. A second challenge often in our markets is that a lot of the investment that we make in sustainability is infrastructure investment. That's a long-term game. It isn't a quick return here tomorrow. It is, you're putting in place big infrastructure projects that'll have a payoff over 10 years. Or back to my scale point, today the technology might be very, very expensive. So something like carbon capture and storage, which is a new technology to sequester, technologically suck carbon out of the atmosphere and either stick it in the ground or put it in a factory to recycle it. The unit cost per ton of carbon removed today in those kinds of solutions is somewhere between $500 and $1,000 a ton. That's not economic. You can't make that math work. If I'm trying to buy those credits, way too expensive, whereas a natural solution might be $50 a ton. The difference is quite vast. When those projects scale, you're going to drive down that cost and you'll make it affordable. So most of us, as you think about your listeners as consumers, we all conceptually say, of course, I'll pay more versus something sustainable. But when you actually get to the grocery store or the retailer and you've got the sustainable option and it's too expensive, as much as emotively you want to buy the sustainable product, it's got to actually not only perform, but it should be at cost parity. And sometimes that takes time to get to that big scale to drive down those unit costs. So that's a challenge in sustainability. I'll call it the short-term, long-term thing. And then the other area is just, in many cases, in order to get some of this to scale, back to my word of, our objective in my job is to try to scale. We need many parts of the system to work together to allow it to happen. So I might need government to change some laws or to speed up permitting processes or whatever it is to get something going. And so it's not just that I can will this to happen. I can have the company and the tech and the capital, but I might need to involve other people in that equation. And sometimes, they've got other priorities and you've got to convince them, or you've got to make the case, or it's just a process, or in some markets we have a lack of expertise. So, there's a lot of challenges, but that's not unexpected when you're trying to do systems change. We're talking about systemic change in a huge way. And then the final bit I'll touch on, and then let's get into opportunities, because I'm the optimist, right? I'm the positive person. Making this happen. Otherwise, I just give up. But if I look across my markets, one of the things I think it was a challenge that I noticed immediately when I came to Standard Chartered, focusing on this part of the world, is that most of the rules of sustainability were written in the West, and they were imposed on, I'll call it, the global South. And, I think it's entirely fair, when the Western world might say something like, you've got to be off petrol cars by year X because we are in the West. Well, the response is, hang on a second, you come to my country and you tell me I'm just getting cars going maybe in a frontier market. And you're telling me, after you've lived off the benefit of a carbon environment for all this time, come to my market and tell me what I need to do. That doesn't work. And also, everybody's got a different starting point. In 52 markets, some of my markets, my China market is all in on green tech, and other markets are barely having access to heat and light. And so you can't have a universal approach. And yet when you're scaling, bigger is better. So it's a hard thing to try to harmonize. But that's part of the challenge of systemic change, is you figure it out.
Yeah, you got to figure it out. True.
Yeah, but opportunities now, and this is the more exciting bit, is that I am amazed every day at the technological innovation. It's really your generation that's inspiring me. I mean, the smartest minds are putting their amazing intellectual capital and passion to work in these solutions. And sometimes the solutions are big T tech, technological change, breakthrough, something that's never been done. And sometimes, frankly, it's something low T tech, as in the change or the innovation is much more around, community action, the power of collective. I think about, we're working on really interesting projects. I always want to relate it to Africa because that's where you guys are housed. But, a really deliberate effort around seaweed, is a naturally growing phenomenon in many waters in coastal Africa. And if we are considered about involving the community, both in the collection and probably the processing, we can create a sustainable crop that's naturally growing, that is a massive protein source. If you're putting it in things, it can replace not so great substitutes. It generally, if you harvest it and plant it in the right way, it's kind of a circular economy type concept. It creates healthy oceans versus other things that we might be, growing and using and wasting, and involving communities to be a part of the equation is the new thing versus sort of having somebody parachute in and do it a different way, Anyway, there's just innovations happening all over the place, and that's exciting to me. I mean, it just inspires me and fires me up because, every day I have the privilege of meeting entrepreneurs who are doing things that are pretty game changing, and they are just thinking way, way, way outside the box. So I'm super, super inspired by, the power of human ingenuity. The other opportunity that I see is that in my markets, we don't have a lot of legacy infrastructure many times. So just like in my old days, back to, what is the same, when we had mobile telephony growing across continents like Asia and Africa, we didn't have legacy telephone systems. So we just leapfrogged. We went straight to mobile. And I even think about it today. I have a home in Africa. The way I do business on my mobile phone in my bank in Africa is so much more advanced than my UK bank in terms of things like its security. I mean, the minute I put petrol or plug in somewhere or buy something in Africa, I get the immediate, text message that says you bought this. Is this legit? From a security point of view, that's what I see in Africa. I don't have that on my UK. It's coming, but I don't have that on my UK phone. So you can leapfrog. And what's really important right now in the energy transition is one of the struggles a lot of the Western markets have is we have very old grid infrastructure, energy grid. And it's a problem because spending money on upgrading the grid at the same time you're trying to power renewables or serve a gigantic increased energy need, it's stressing the infrastructure. Whereas in a lot of my developing markets, we can build the smart grid at the same time, we're building these renewable powered factories. So those go hand in hand. It's a lot less expensive and it's much more efficient. So, these are some of the opportunities that I see in my market that are very different than perhaps somewhere else in the world.
Wow. Nice.
You make very, very great points, and I'm not going to go over all of them because be conscious of time.
Yeah.
But one key one that really stuck out to me is that challenges are expected when you're trying to make systemic change, which is, I think, a really important thing for people to think about and also remember when thinking about sustainability, right? And also tying that into what you said about, the infrastructure. It's easier for emerging markets to leapfrog. And I say this all the time, and even say this when I'm speaking with African clients and people living in Africa, that yes, we're disproportionately affected. Yes, it's a different experience for us because we didn't create kind of the climate change problem. Yeah. We have an opportunity to create solutions because we have some of these gaps that we can export, to the global stage. So I love that you said that as well, I think.
And can I touch on one other skill that I love in my markets, especially Africa, is by definition, a developing market has operated with less, right? When you're abundant and you have everything at your fingertips, it's all easy. You don't actually build the resiliency muscle. And I always say, if I'm going to bet on someone, I'd rather bet on someone with an enormous amount of enthusiasm and passion that understands how to build a business, I'll say it on a shoestring, you know what I mean? Because you don't have a lot of resource. You figure it out. So every time a challenge happens, you just find a way around it and you navigate. And that is a really important skill in an entrepreneur and in these big system change, because you will hit hurdles, you'll hit one after another. And you can either let it consume you and you give up, and that happens a lot in the entrepreneurial world, or you can just say, you know what, that's part of the game, and I'll go on to the next one. And I see that sort of almost already that muscle is built and developed in my developing markets when we think about, who we're backing as entrepreneurs and scale capital investee companies.
Definitely. I think resilience is one thing we have in spades in the I will agree with that. So I think that ties really, really nicely into the next question, which is that sustainable finance, as you've identified and talked through, kind of through this conversation, is becoming very much a mainstream conversation in banking. And so going back to Standard Chartered being kind of a pioneer bank in a lot of these initiatives, what role would you say that Standard Chartered plays in financing the transition to low carbon economy?
Sure. So the way we've organized my structure, my CSO organization, is in some ways with this idea that we do need innovation in order to create this kind of change. The system that we've relied on for the last, 40 years or so, the industrial solutions, aren't fit for purpose for the new world. So you've got to think outside the box. So it's going to require deliberate space, I'll call it, for innovation. Now, innovation doesn't often fit so well in a large, mature organization, particularly a bank. So I wanted to be quite deliberate about it. And this is what I brought from experimentation in my prior role as CSO. So I created a series of innovation hubs where they are protected spaces for subject matter experts and teams to go in, and their job is to try to create breakthrough solutions in these particular themes, back to let's go narrow and deep in places that could really matter and make a difference. But this is a different form of finance. And so my 4 innovation hubs are around the themes of the carbon markets, because, I think about in Africa, right? You have these enormous carbon natural assets, that can sequester carbon if they're protected properly, but then they need to be monetized in order to pay for the conservation, for instance. And the carbon markets have a big role to play in creating the money to keep the conservation, which creates the positive virtuous circle. So it's very important for us that we help us promote and foster and create high integrity in the carbon markets. Nature finance is another area. They're sort of intertwined in a way. Again, the private sector world never used to think about investing for profit in nature. And yet, in my old life, I hired the first head of nature in a bank, and people are like, "What's she doing? What? Head of nature in a bank, huh?" And my head of nature was from ZSL, the Zoological Society of London. I mean, talk about a wacky person from a wacky position in a bank. But yet my vision was that nature finance was going to be something that would scale and be critically important. And if we were deliberate about it, we could create some breakthroughs. And we created a structure called a debt for nature swap. And a debt for nature swap, critically important in many debt-stressed emerging markets, particularly ones that are island nations. In Standard Chartered's footprint, we have about 80% of our footprint market are coastal dependent economies. So the theory behind this and the structure that we created, which was a first of its kind, was called a debt for nature swap. And what this means is you go to a debt-ridden country and say, I'm prepared to help you refinance or restructure your debts. So push out your maturities, reduce your interest cost under one condition, that we take a portion of the refinance proceeds and we ring fence it. We put in a protected space to be allocated only for nature conservation. And in the case of the island nations, it's to invest back in the oceans. It could be sustainable fishing or creating infrastructure so waste doesn't go into the ocean and kill kind of the flora and fauna in the ocean, or clean up the beaches, or whatever the thing is. And the beautiful thing about that is when you're investing in conservation in those island dependent, marine dependent nations, is that money invested comes back and feeds the GDP of the country. So it's a positive win-win-win. It's a win for nature, a win for the country, a win for the people of the country, et cetera. It was a novel structure that had never been done before. And the fabulous thing now is we're replicating it and scaling it. And so one country after another, are accessing this kind of capital. And now we're extending it. It doesn't have to be marine conservation. It could be food, debt for food swap. It could be debt for healthcare. And so now we're thinking about this systemically in different ways of using that technology to solve a tricky problem of an over-indebted country. It started with nature. So these are things we're deeply proud of that are very, very differentiating, but really super relevant and important in sustainability. And then I'll finally close on the decarbonization side, because all these are intertwined, right? Carbon markets are funding decarbonization. Nature is funding natural ways of sequestering carbon. But then there's the decarbonization of the existing infrastructure, heavy to abate industries, oil and gas and transportation and shipping and what have you. What we're doing there and what we did deliberately was set up a transition finance team in my organization. And we hired very non-traditional bankers. We hired people who were engineers and scientists and academics who would help us figure out how to advise our clients on this decarbonization journey, or how, as an engineer, do you operationalize this journey inside a large company, and so on. And so that expertise that we created in-house made us very valuable to these decarbonization clients. and made us a partner of choice when they want to fund that journey. So we've helped them on the advisory side, and we've helped them on the capital side. And that's how we're playing a big role in the sort of what I call global decarbonization picture in our key markets, especially around some of these hard to abate sectors.
I mean, that's incredible. And I kind of want to apply to work in the sustainability team at Standard.
We do have a lot of people that want to come work for us, which is great. Take all the great talent.
Well, that's nice. And that leads me to my next question in terms of what sectors or regions are currently seeing the most demand for sustainable financing solutions, and where do you see the greatest potential for growth?
It's really hard to answer that because there is no one size fits all. It's more what works in what country.
Okay.
And why do I say that? In some markets, you can go straight to green. Back to my point before, is you could leapfrog and go straight to green. In other countries, Nigeria is a good example. Your economy is an oil economy, and to decarbonize Nigeria, you've got such embedded infrastructure. Of course, you can add some solar or maybe wind or whatever, but the path to green will probably be going oil to efficient gas, LNG gas, to green, probably. That'll be your trajectory. And that's okay, because efficient gas is typically what we say is about 3 times less carbon emitting than, say, heavy oil. And if that's the transition pathway, because the infrastructure is easier to fund that's okay. I mean, we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere and we're decarbonizing. That's what transition means. So that's why I say it's kind of hard you almost have to go country by country to say, what's your starting point? What's your energy mix? What does it lend itself to? Maybe another example on the extreme other end is a country like Indonesia. It's a whole bunch of islands, and every island has a different composition. Some are suited for wind, some solar, some hydro. So one country, you might have every variation on the theme, because what works there, on that decarbonization journey will be very different. So I think you have to apply it horses by courses, as they say. That's a UK phrase. But there are some areas or some countries where the scaling is just going through the roof. And I would point to a country like India. Some of that is policy, because the Indian government has very clearly said they want the energy mix to be 50-50 in short order. And that's a fast growing economy. It's growing sort of 8% a year. So if you figure wherever they're starting from today, which is coal and other heavy industry, if you're going to grow 8% and you're going to change your mix, the growth of the energy, the renewable side has got to just, be extra high. They're putting in solar fields, as fast as you can possibly imagine. You need an airplane to fly over a solar field now, they're so big. So the scaling of that is just almost hard to imagine unless you actually see it in practice. So there are certain countries like that are just, you see it happening, and we're helping to finance that, and that's an exciting.
Awesome.
It's proving that it can be done, by the way. What I think is a great serving as role models of how to scale.
That's nice. Well done to you and your team.
Yeah.
You've identified something that's actually so interesting about climate change, and something that I've thought about and seen around, but haven't quite figured out how to spell out. Climate change is so interesting because it's a global problem that really, really requires bespoke and often very personal is not the correct word I'm thinking of, but very granular approach to solve it in different communities, regions, which is very unlike any other sector I can think of.
And that's what makes it fascinating, but difficult, because I've often thought through my career, a big innovation would be a new asset class or a new industry. This is every asset class, every industry, every country, right? We're trying to do this globally, this thing that's never been done before across every system we know and use, and every financial, asset class, et cetera, et cetera. And it is, you see why it's so hard, because this is something that is just, it's so gigantic that how do you get your head around it? But this is why you've got to be quite considered and figure out, I think, where can you make the biggest difference? Apply your effort where that impact will be outsized, because then I think you create that classic 80-20 rule. You know, that 20% that I'm focusing on could have that outsized 80% impact on my companies and clients.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Something I'm going to think a lot more about. Also, this idea that we need all hands involved. So at every level, you know, government, private sector, third sector people, to kind of address the challenge. Okay, I want to get all the questions because you're giving great insights.
Yeah.
How do you think banks can balance profitability with long-term sustainability commitments? And I guess the more interesting question to me is, do you think financial markets are adequately incentivizing companies to transition to net zero?
I think with both those answers, it's a nuanced answer. You'd be surprised if I said it was black or white or clean or, you know, green or not green, whichever way you want to say it, just because it's complicated. All these things are complicated. I think to answer your second question first about, you know, does a system adequately incent? The traditional financial system in some ways doesn't, because it doesn't take into account, if back to my original comment, the impact, negative or positive, what we're doing, you know, today. Do we price in when we pollute and build something that's polluting? You know, do you put a price on that pollution? If you did, you wouldn't do it, right? You'd be incented not to do it, but we don't always price those things in appropriately or with the right, you know, price tag. And that's why you see oftentimes things that seem perverse. Or we might have subsidies that are there for some historical legacy reason at a given industry that allow it to perpetuate, when if those subsidies didn't exist, that industry wouldn't be able to survive on its own. So it's essentially kind of propped up. And it might be one of those industries that is a high polluting industry. Those don't logically make sense if you step back and say, with a climate lens, would you actually do that? So this is part of this challenge of, I call it the resetting of the financial system, to take those sorts of things into account. Another area I might point to where I don't think it works is where we take from nature because we assume it will always give to us, the quote unquote a common good that we don't pay for. And yet the actions that we're taking because we think it's an endless resource are destroying the very thing that we rely on. Oceans, perfect example, right? A quarter of the world gets its primary source of food from the ocean. The ocean sequesters 25% of all carbon and mitigates global warming. And yet we're overfishing the ocean. We keep dumping stuff in the ocean. The oceans are acidifying fast. They're overfished. The plastics equation, I think we're very well aware of. So, and why are we doing it? It's not because we're bad people. It's not because, you know, but what people just conceptually at a you know, sort of granular level think that this thing will keep giving and giving because it's always given and given. And it's so vast and so big and nobody owns it, so I can keep taking from it. And that's where the system hasn't done a good job, admittedly. Now, the positive end of that is the awareness level is rising, and these coalitions across the public sector and the private sector that you were talking about, where everybody's got to get involved, is coming together to try to solve these difficult problems. For the first time ever, it looks like we're going to get an agreement, what's called this High Seas Treaty, because island nations only own 200 miles legally of coastline. That's it. After 200 miles, you don't own it. Fish don't respect borders, right? So, you know, if you don't have some sort of agreement on what you're going to do outside the 200, you know, we'll keep damaging the ocean. So these are things where I think this awareness of sustainability is coming into play and creating coalitions of the willing to really tackle some of these challenges. So I guess that's I would say both sides of the coin to try to answer your question. I don't know is there any more to the question that I haven't covered that you might want me to touch on?
Yeah. No.
You see, when Labake asked that question, she said this question was very important to her. And so the next question is also very important to me. And you serve on multiple advisory boards, including the UN Ocean Panel and the World Economic Forum, which I'm glad to be a global shaper part of. And how do these global collaborations influence financial institutions in terms of their sustainability strategies?
Sure. It is a little bit what I was talking about, that there is no one actor that can solve this.
Yeah.
We really, in these big systemic problems, you need partnerships and coalitions. And each of us brings something to the table. What I bring is capital or ability to structure transactions. A private sector, a government can help change laws or create codes of how to operate. An NGO, which is a very unusual partner in a financial structure, but yet in my Debt for Nature swaps, the first time ever we partnered with an NGO in the same deal. And why? Because the NGO that took that money that I talked about that was ring fenced to help hold off for ocean conservation, I didn't know how to apply that money. I'm not a biologist or a scientist. These ocean NGOs know, though. They can take that capital and say, if I put it to work here in the ocean, it's going to make a big impact. So partnering with someone with that expertise is the perfect answer to solve that particular problem. So these types of coalitions are really important. I'll give you maybe one really crisp answer of one of the ones I'm involved in, which is the CEO Alliance of Climate Leaders. Quite a mouthful.
Okay.
But it's a World Economic Forum sponsored initiative of senior C-suite executives, mostly CEOs. And we sat around the table and said, what is prohibiting some industries from taking off and scaling, particularly in the renewable space? And we landed on the wind sector, where wind turbines to produce are extremely expensive. And often in the history, they've been produced by virgin steel, which is a high carbon emitting industry. But to produce those out of recycled or scrap steel, which would be a circular economy principle and much less carbon emitting, was too expensive. And the turbine manufacturers that were in the room said, if somebody would pre-order, give us a demand signal and said, I will buy from you, and it may be a marginally higher cost, it would give us the confidence to invest in creating turbines that were made from recycled steel. And that it was just that coalition of people in the room. And I said, well, I can finance that because I want to finance more. And it would be part of my net zero commitment as a bank to finance more carbon efficient types of technologies and infrastructure projects. So those three actors sitting in a room, the buyer, the producer, the financier, kicking stuff around to saying, where are we getting stuck, created an opportunity to build a better product that was much more sustainable. So that's just one small example of why these kinds of coalitions and getting these different folks around the room saying, where are we getting stuck and how do we help each other, can lead to some really nice outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that's also very important because if you look at the 17 SDG, Goal 17 talks about partnership. That is why partnership is very, very important for us to be able to achieve what we want to achieve. I was telling someone, I think that Goal 17 being Goal 17 was for a reason, because 100%. Basically carries all the other goals and we can achieve the other goals if partnership. And it's good to see that collaboration is something that is being discussed. And so, yeah, well done.
And, in my world, if I'm kind of take you way back to the beginning of my career, you never saw collaboration across banks.
Yeah.
We were arch competitors, I can't tell you, my secret sauce because, that is my secret sauce. If I share with you, that's a competitive disadvantage. And you saw it in consumer products, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, heaven forbid, would never talk to each other.
Yeah.
Rivals and so on. And yet in climate, it's bigger than any one of us. Yeah. And so I've seen collaborations that I've never seen before where we'll call up our fellow bank and say, the two of us are much more powerful in this equation than one of us trying to take all the spoils. And it's just been a very, very different way of operating in the climate space, which I find very positive, right? It's a very much, I'd say, energizing to me to have that behavior change in pursuit of these big challenges in solving them.
Well, it's glad to see that brands are coming together. Oh God, climate change is bringing brands together to make the world a better place.
Exactly. I love that. I'm going to steal that line. I like it.
I was going to crack a silly joke about it being like the Avengers, but I realized maybe not everybody watches the Avengers.
All the superheroes together.
Exactly. The superheroes band together to kind of tackle one big problem. So my question now is, the private sector is increasingly expected to financing gap for climate solutions. In your opinion and from your experience, what more do you think the other sectors, like the public sector, government, regulators, what can they do to create an environment that enables and fosters sustainable finance?
I really do think it's we're landing on it with this collaboration bit, because as I said before, even with my ocean example of working with the NGO, we know what we do well in private sector, and governments know what they do well. We don't do what they do, and they don't do what we do. So if we could get together and communicate clearly on where we are getting stuck or where we have a need, and there's a receptivity to listen, good things can happen. And it sounds so obvious, when I say that, isn't that screamingly obvious? Yes and no, because I remember sitting around the table in some of these blended finance discussions where you do have public and private sector in the same room. And because historically everyone's operated in silos, so government is this job, and public sector finances this, MDBs and multilateral banks do this, and banks do that. So everybody was in their narrow silo. We always made assumptions about the other person, what they can do and what they can't do. And it was fascinating. We actually said, well, you know what, maybe there's a world where we all get in the room together, again, with a common pursuit, and we all bring something slightly different that if we add it all together, it creates a multiplier effect. So 1 + 1 + 1 is not 3, it's 10.
Yeah.
But those first early days, and I sat on something called the Blended Finance Task Force of the World Economic Forum, and the theory was fantastic. And we all, in our silos were like, yeah, got around the table. And I remember assuming that the World Bank would do X, and the World Bank assumed that I would do Y. And we were talking a completely different language. And the assumptions that we were making, the language we were using is we just didn't understand each other. So then you had to basically have each person say, what could they do? What couldn't they do? What were their risk tolerances or whatever their particular issues were. And it was quite eye-opening for people to say, oh, I didn't realize, And then all of a sudden with that dialogue, and anytime you go veer off a little bit because it got quite complicated, you'd go remind yourself to go back to that common purpose. What are we doing here? What are we ultimately trying to solve? And then, you kind of get everybody back together again. Then eventually, everyone's began to understand what each other could contribute. And then the magic started to happen. But it was easier said than done. But I think that that's a version of an answer to your question, is that if you have a willing government, or the reverse is true. If the government says, here's where I'm getting stuck, I need more private capital to allocate to this, and listen to where the public sector or the private sector could or couldn't work, you can kind of work your way through what, how to find some common ground. But I think it has to start with a common ambition. I think about where we've had some great breakthroughs. Singapore, the Singaporean government has a green mandate, a green growth mandate. And I remember sitting around the table with them saying, I don't understand why we're not getting more green mortgages going in Singapore. And we said, well, actually, do you realize that the Singaporean government, nobody tracks emissions of buildings? There's no law that says you have to do that. Now, in the UK, where I live, you can't rent a property or buy a property without getting an emissions certificate, so you know whether you have a high or low building. And it was just one of those things that just hadn't been done. So the Singapore government said, oh, okay, I'll change the rule. I'll make every developer or building owner or operator track their emissions. Then as a bank, I'm like, okay, good. Then I can finance a green mortgage because I know what the emissions are. It was as simple as that, but it just had never been done. So it's these kinds of things. I think sometimes it's a simple, having a conversation and listening to each other and figuring out how to get the job done.
Incredible. I think it also shows this collaboration, not just in working together, but in sharing information, right? Each person learning what's working here, what the challenges are, what the opportunities are, and kind of applying as it sees fit. So, so much opportunity in kind of the sector. Yeah.
See, I was trying to paint a scenario in my head for my next question, and I told myself not to bother because I'm sure you do it on a regular, right? You walk into a room that has business leaders and investors who want to integrate sustainability into their financial decision making, but don't know how to start. Imagine yourself in front of them, right? What advice would you give to them?
So I think the first answer I would give is where we've touched on a little bit, is to really listen and to articulate your problem. Don't be shy at where you are getting stuck. If it's fundamental, like I don't even know where to start, then you might start with what are your problems? What are you trying to solve?
Yeah.
And oftentimes, if you're very clear on what you're trying to solve and you put yourself out there in a room full of experts, whether they be finance or operational or policymaking, whatever, they can say, okay, I can help you with that, or I can do that. And then, you begin to find that common ground to get you started. Someone can help you. The other way I would go is, luckily now, because we are advancing so quickly, there are many, many case studies. So if you are a company that looks like X and you say, I'm trying to solve Y, there very well may be a case study that shows you the roadmap of how it's done. I'm a big believer in, especially in the climate space, sharing the successes. To me, the greatest form of flattery, as we call it, is when you copy paste it, do it again, but just do it bigger next time. We're really big and keen about putting that information out there. And I think more and more there are these forums for, what's working. And or what didn't work. So what do we learn from where we got stuck last time? So that's another avenue. If you're talking about more in the education arena, there's just an enormous amount of content now, and watch the space on AI. I think AI is going to be a really big help to the climate equation, whether it's crunching complex biodiversity data, or just frankly, hey, how do I do something? Chat GPT or whatever source you're using. How do I get started? How do I finance a project? Or I'm an early stage company. What kind of capital could I attract? What do I need to attract capital? How do I present myself to the right investor? I think those are very simple questions you could ask an AI agent these days and get a pretty decent answer. So that's another source it's worth thinking about.
All right. So on behalf of the business leaders and investors, I say thank you for the answer.
You're very welcome.
I think my final question, which I want to start by saying thank you so much for this conversation, so much knowledge, experience, and really critical questions that have been answered and raised through the conversation. And as we're kind of rounding up, what we like to do with our guests is ask them to share a call to action for our listeners, whether they're in finance, whether they're in business, individuals, anybody. Our audience is really, really diverse across 100 countries, right? A call to action to them to kind of make more sustainable financial choices. So that's my final question.
Okay, well, I can answer that question at an individual level, and also in your jobs, in your whatever it is that you do for a living, because there are ways to be more sustainable or influence sustainability in both. As an individual and a consumer, I do sometimes find that the consumer or the individual feels overwhelmed. This is all too big or all too hard. What can I possibly do? But just remember that power of the collective is real. In something as powerful as your consumer wallet, just take your generation. If you said, I'm deliberate about what I buy, and you need to be informed, because, don't believe every single label. And, again, back to AI, I think it will help us, because sometimes there's a lot of marketing hype and you need to get underneath the hood and look at the substance. But, if you added up every single person and every one of your listeners and 5 people they know, and you all started to vote in the same way with your consumer wallet, with what you buy and don't buy, you would get a response from the companies you're buying from. I guarantee you. But first of all, you are the attractive generation that everybody wants, right? To attract. So you can demand, and you should demand, what it is that you want to see from your company. So I think that is a simple thing you can do. You should also be informed. Everything from what kind of car do you buy? Do you use plastic? What are you eating? What are you buying for your fashion? What are you doing with your waste? Little tiny things do really, really add up. On the business front, with what you do in your day job, you don't have to be a CSO or be in sustainable finance or even a sustainability profession to make a difference. Every single job that exists today will have some element where you can influence sustainability. If you're a lawyer, what are the policies in your legal department that you could weave into your company's behavior? If you're in procurement and you're buying from vendors, are you helping to influence a set of standards to say, I want to buy from sustainable vendors? If you're a financier, hopefully it's clear, because that's what we've been talking about for the last hour. If you are in marketing, hopefully you're leading with substance, not marketing. What are those things that you're doing to drive? Look and, I'm constantly inspired by our employee base. They'll look at things that sometimes I don't even see, in terms of how they think about our sustainability practices. We're going through a big building renovation now. And as we renovate our building, of course, we're doing what I call the obvious things, like putting in sensor technology for our lights and more efficient HVAC systems and so on. But, some of our employees came and said, what are we going to do with the old everything, the old equipment, the old rugs? And it challenged us to say, well, let's take our old rugs that we're ripping off the floor that aren't going to be reused and figure out, could they be repurposed in some form? Could they be recycled into something else? And we've created almost an extraordinary circular economy building retrofit. And it was just by, thinking about just every aspect of what we do and how we consume and buy, and then ultimately waste or not waste things or reuse things. So I think there's just so much there if you just open your eyes. So educate yourself as much as possible.
Yeah.
And the more you, it's like an onion, the more you peel back the layers, trust me, the more you'll find. So that would be your call to arms.
Awesome. I think that's a very clear one. Inform yourself, deliberate choices with your consumer wallet. That's definitely one I'm going to run with a little bit louder.
Yeah.
I've got my Echo pen here even, this has been all
nice.
material. So you see these little things,
All the choices add up. So
choices.
Awesome.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Marisa. And I'll just close with this, that as the world races against time to combat climate change, sustainable finance is no longer an option. I see it as a necessity. And so the power to drive real and lasting impact lies in how we invest, how we innovate, and how we collaborate. And so let's turn our financial capital into climate action and shape a future where both our economies and our ecosystem can thrive. And the shift starts now. And we want to say a very big thank you to Marisa, the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Standard Chartered Bank, for joining us on the podcast today and being our first guest of season 3 of the podcast. So thank you so much, Marisa, for joining us. And we look forward to staying in touch and seeing the amazing things that you and the bank will do to protect our environment and to protect the planet. So thank you so much, Marisa.
That was beautifully said. And thank you very much for having me. And I look forward to hearing the other way what your listeners are doing. So there you go, two-way street.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.